very much, especially Phil, who didn't actually have to be here. And I didn't realise this was the site of Australia's first ever employment service run by Carolyn Chisholm set up. So it's really appropriate for what we're doing here at IPPE. So I've allowed myself 43 seconds per slide, so we'll dash through it. 5 years of study in 30 minutes, and actually self-regulation is one of my worst skills or strengths, so I'll set myself a timer there just to make sure I don't overrun. Okay, so the structure of this will be, first of all, obviously the introduction, the gaps in the literature. Just realised I can't read it from there, I need glasses. Research problems and the lit review. And then I'll take you through 4 studies that we've undertaken, which comprise 3 papers that we've put together. And then obviously what's the significance of this thesis. Overall, this thesis, I guess, is about unemployment and the conclusion that unemployment is bad. But of course, to set that scene, we had to research first and look at the economic costs. And with each of these, it's about $30 billion a year in terms of direct payments to job seekers, support to help them get back to work, and loss of tax revenue. So it's a massive sector to target and to try and apply what we're doing here at IPPE to this group. There's a huge societal cost in terms of suicide, health, crime, where there are high levels of unemployment. All of these things are much higher, of course. But predominantly, there's a massive mental health cost to each individual that's unemployed. There's a huge amount of literature on this. In fact, it's the most well-researched part of being unemployed, the mental health cost. One of my favourite facts is from this Lucas et al. Study that found out that when a man is made redundant, it takes him 5.1 years to recover from being made redundant in terms of his life satisfaction set point. It takes 5.1 years. Even if he gets a job 6 months after first being made redundant. To put that in context, as a benchmark, it takes him 4.9 years to get over the death of his wife. So it's much more impactful. If any of you have ever sat with a job seeker, an unemployed person, you'll realise that the literature, you can see it there right in front of you, the levels of anxiety, stress and depression are at similar levels to returning servicemen and women from theatres of war. And even if they haven't got high levels of anxiety, stress and depression, then they're embarrassed. The literature shows they're embarrassed and they try and big up their issues to you as a case manager, as somebody facing them, trying to help them back into work. If unemployment is so bad, and employment is shown to be so good, I'll show you the evidence for that in a moment, surely everyone is trying their utmost to get back to work. Of course. And here is the literature. After 5 years of searching, it's a barren desert of no literature telling us whether people are really genuinely trying to get back to work. And indeed, the government, this is me trying to find the reason, the welfare support, the government treatment as usual, if you like, assumes that everybody's trying to get back to work. It provides interview skills, job search skills, resume writing support, vocational training. It assumes that job seekers are proactively attempting to return to work, although we all suspect intuitively that not everybody's trying their utmost to return to work. And in fact, when job seekers are asked, what are the things holding you back from getting a job, 13% say, yes, indeed, I'm lacking the necessary skills to get back to work. But 17% say it's health or disability, including mental health, is holding me back. Now bear in mind this is the general unemployment scheme, not the specific disability employment scheme the government offers. So there's a big part here to play for focusing upon mental health. So the overall hypothesis of this thesis is that 3 interrelated processes promote job seeking and employment: well-being, self-efficacy and resilience. And you can start to see the relevance here with the department. And this programme that we've put together to help job seekers get back to work targets these 3 components. And welfare itself is defined as a state of doing well, especially in respect to good fortune, happiness, but well-being and prosperity. Well-being negatively is impacted by employment. Low well-being is linked to lower productivity, interest, and a heightened sense of helplessness and inadequacy, a lower ability to return to work. So one would presume, one would hypothesize that As such, low well-being may drive poor return to work outcomes. Now, if we look at the benefits of working, why one should bother working, the main piece of literature here is Granger Hoder's 1982 publication, says that employment provides all of these benefits. In fact, when you say to somebody, what does employment provide that's good for you? Most people say money. Well, that comes about 6th on the list. These are the main benefits that she identified, and you can see the remarkable similarities with the PERMA definition of what makes up well-being. So we can see there's a fit here with well-being and unemployment. And well-being interventions for job seekers, well, how have they worked to get people back to work and improve outcomes? Similarly, there is a dearth of literature on this. There's not very much there, apart from one little glimmer of hope. This is Chicago, and there was a program there called the Jobs, and then the Jobs 2 program in Michigan, and then they replicated it in their Tuhun program. That's been most of my effort, is learning how to pronounce that incorrectly. That's in Finland. And what they found was increases in job search intensity and success come from focusing on psychological interventions that aim to build self-efficacy, inoculation against setbacks, resilience, well-being, and a sense of control. So let's have a look at these constructs. We've looked at well-being. Self-efficacy, of course, is among the most commonly used psychological terms in well-being and POS-psych related papers. It's the belief that you can change your own future, you can have the capacity to undertake behaviours required to produce specific goals. And self-efficacy is a significant factor in improving the likelihood of job seekers in obtaining employment. There is a good deal of research on this. Higher self-efficacy equals higher return to work rates. And resilience, well, the most standout data that we could find in the literature was that resilient adults are 81% more likely to return to work. And of course, resilience, we'll have a look at the definitions of the 7 pillars of this, but it's to bounce back from adversity or move forward when the opportunity arises. So, to summarise this introduction, the research questions are all job seekers actually job seeking? Are there different stages or levels of job seeking commitment? Then, can a well-being, self-efficacy and resilience building psychosocial intervention, we might call it a positive psychological intervention, reactivate job seekers? And can a job seeker stage of job seeking commitment inform person-centric interventions that improve return to work outcomes? And there's one final bit that I wanted to touch on at the end of this introduction, good, 8 minutes now, is this thing called creaming and parking. It's common knowledge in the sector of employment services that companies and even government departments focus on those that want to get a job and get them back into work quickly. They cream those and they park the ones that don't necessarily want to get a job, aren't enthusiastic or aren't proactive. Creaming and parking. So I guess the moral imperative, the emotional driver for me with this whole thesis over the last 5.5 years is, can we find a way of not giving up on those that parked? Is there a way of reactivating them and moving them forward? So, the first study, are job seekers job seeking? Validating a stage of change tool to predict employment outcomes. So, I looked at obviously what I thought would happen, how I found out what would happen, and then what actually happens and any relevance findings or implications. So the first hypothesis is discrete levels or stages of job-seeking commitment exist. Again, remember couldn't find any research on this at all. These stages accurately predict job placement rates. And the lit review from this, where I got most of the data, was the Transtheoretical model of change, where you might have come across the stage of change model, mostly been used with anti-smoking or addictive behaviours previously. These are the different stages. Pre-contemplation smoker is somebody that has absolutely no intention of giving up smoking, whereas somebody in the action stage really wants to give up smoking. So do these similar levels and discrete stages exist for job seekers? Pre-contemplation, no intention at all of trying to get back to work, whereas somebody in the action stage really wants to get back to work. We used just over 1,200 participants, undertook a stage of change assessment, an assessment of their work readiness. We had to change the questions. We worked quite closely with the University of Rhode Island and Dr. Prochaska, who co-invented this, if you like. We had to change some of the questions, make sure they fitted. We did a double check with Prochaska and Levesque, the leading proponents of the stage change model. And basically it gives you 3 different scores that you plot after undertaking the survey, the 12-question survey on here. And once you join the dots, you look and see, well, what's that most similar to? That tells me what stage of change somebody's in. So before rolling this out across 1,200 individuals, we did a pilot with about 200 people in Essex in Britain and Bundaberg in Melbourne. And it was invaluable doing this first pilot before we did a big rollout. We found out I had to train up psychs how to use this survey. It took them 26 minutes to score the paper-based survey. 5 additional languages were requested. It was difficult getting the ethics message across. Quite often, the case managers would just ignore that bit. You know, I stood in, I oversaw it, and I could see they weren't getting the initial ethics message, so we had to sit on that a bit. But there was also this bias. We found that when a case manager asks somebody, are you trying to get to work, are you doing this, are you doing that, then naturally, I suppose, one would presume people were more positive in their responses. We found that 62% were in action, whereas when people were left to fill in this form on their own, it was more like 26%. So there was a big bias. But also, the psychs were misscoring the charts 32% of the time. Due to their own biases, one presumes, we're not sure. And there was a resistance to a mechanical scoring in case managers. I've been doing this job 20 years, how can 12 questions on a piece of paper tell me whether they're really trying to get a job or not better than I can? We solved most of these by putting the survey online. So it took 1 second to score. We could force people that they couldn't proceed unless they'd read the ethics message and the support message, and they answered it themselves rather than the case managers answering it. So then we were ready to roll this out across 1,200 people. What actually happened? Well, people did fall into these categories, but we actually discovered a new category. A new stage of change called unauthentic action. It was termed unauthentic action. We concurred with the University of Rhode Island, or discussed with them, and these have been taken all the actions to get a job, but had absolutely no intention at all of getting a job. And I suppose there are different coercions in place to make people answer in that manner. So, did these discrete stages predict job-seeking success? And it did. Actually, it was perfectly linear. The lower down you were, the less likely you were to be in work in 6 months' time. An action person was more than twice as likely to be in work than a pre-contemplative individual. And then we found something else really fascinating. These were the proportions of those 1,213 people, and we found, it's a correlation, but I found it geekily interesting, that there was exactly 1/3 genuinely trying to get a job, the action and preparation individuals, and 2/3 for whatever reason not having the confidence or the desire to return to work. And it exactly correlated with the learned helplessness literature, and the discovery there that 2/3 of all species that were tested in the face of repeated adversity over which you've got no control just give up, curl up, conserve energy. So that encouraged me a bit more with the well-being interventions, the almost post-site intervention. So, of course, this study did find that there's discrete stages of change, there's a new stage of change, there's a correlation with learned helplessness, but do stages respond differently to interventions? That would let me know how to focus interventions on individuals. So paper 2, though, is what is this intervention? We had to put together a positive psych intervention or a psychosocial intervention, which is the parlance in the sector. So we presumed or hypothesised that a psychosocial intervention will improve placement rates above treatment as usual. All that action-focused stuff that government funds, if we worked on people's well-being, resilience and self-efficacy, would we get a higher return to work rate? We obviously looked at all the literature, so I'm going to flick through this, but this took nearly 2 years of research, study, putting together this intervention, which we called resilience workshops. We initially called well-being workshops, but turn-up rates were lower because people were confused or had some sort of bias against the term well-being. So once we called them resilience workshops, then more men turned up. We worked through lots of different theories. spoke to lots of the great advocates in the sector. We looked at the 7 different pillars of resilience as put together by Andrew Chatte, who's an Aussie, who used to work in employment services over here, and Karen Ryvich, and then tried to find interventions or exercises that would build that were evident. And then I thought, how on earth are we going to get this out to the number of people that wanted to take part in this study and then the follow-on study? And luckily, University of Pennsylvania said, just copy this model, train up the sergeant majors, whoever they are, and get them to cascade the models and train them up thoroughly in what turned into a 15-hour resilience workshop. That's the psychosocial intervention, comprising 31 evidence exercises that build either self-efficacy, well-being, or resilience. We rolled this out with that number of young people, 75, and there was a comparison in exactly the same area, 246. Encouragingly, in this pilot, we found that the young people, 64% of them got a job placement, versus 42% that undertook treatment as usual. But also, interestingly or encouragingly, 72% of them were still in that job 3 months later, whereas only 57% of those that hadn't undertaken self-efficacy, well-being and resilience interventions were there. So yes, it does improve outcomes. One thing we found, we really had to contextualise a lot of these interventions. Asking a room full of 17-year-olds in South Brisbane to stand in a circle, hold hands and say what went well in the last 24 hours. They sort of went like that and walked out. But we had to contextualise it and change some of these interventions for the individuals without changing the fundamentals. So now we've got an intervention. Do the different stages respond differently? And this is really the bulk of my thesis. The evaluation of a job seeker's segmentation tool, that is putting them into the different stages of change, and an intervention model. There are 2 stages to this. First of all, we hypothesised that this psychosocial intervention will work with adults, because we've only done it with 15 to 25-year-olds. We hypothesised that different stages of change will respond at different rates to this, because that would support the rest of this stage of change theory, Transtheoretical model of change, and moderators' impact on response. We were finding in all the literature that men and women might respond differently, different cultures, different ages, different streams, which is something the government uses to segment job seekers. So we wanted to start looking at that. So we started researching all these different modifiers of return to work, and this had about 2,500 participants. 549 went through the stage of change assessment and the psychosocial intervention. And this is what we found. So I'll pull out the interesting stuff so you don't get cross-eyed with this. First of all, we found that overall there was an increase in placement rates for the treatment of 33% return to work compared to the treatment as usual, 27%. So that's a 22% lift up from 27% to 33%. We also found that people did respond at different rates to the return to work intervention or psychosocial intervention. For me, personally, encouragingly, contemplators and pre-contemplators were very positive responders to this. But something really weird came out of this. The action stage did not respond. People that were already really up for a job did not respond well or at all to this intervention. 33% in the business as usual got a job, 32% who undertook our psychosocial intervention got a job. And then we looked at some of these other moderators. Time unemployed, well, yes, those most recently unemployed, shortest term unemployed, responded the best, but overall people responded really well throughout their length of unemployment, even 48 months. But in this survey, or in this study, we didn't have anyone from remote areas. We only had metropolitan and inner and outer regional, but mostly inner regional. So we didn't have any answers on those sort of modifiers on how people will respond. We didn't have anything on ethnicity, to people that consider themselves called culturally and linguistically diverse. Did Indigenous Australians respond just as well to this treatment? And gender, there was something strange going on here with no response at all for women, for female participants. And then there was something else weird. Over 55s went down as well, a bit like the action stage. And there was only 250 participants in that group, so we wanted to really study that and have more participants in the next study, which aims to answer all these questions. So what happened? Yes, we got an increase in return to work rate with the psychosocial intervention versus treatment as usual. Stages did respond differently. There was no value though for those in action. So do we have an argument here that individualised coaching would deliver better results based on people's stage? And we needed to really look at those moderators a bit more and get answers to see whether everybody's responding appropriately. And that's what we did with this fourth and final study. We looked at stage matching the psychosocial workshop and one-to-ones. Would they deliver better return to work rates than treatment as usual, but also just giving everyone the 15-hour resilience workshops, psychosocial intervention. And we needed to gather more moderator data. So the study here, or the literature review, was about the stage of change in interventions. There's lots of good studies that tell you what to do with each individual in each of those discrete stages of change. And the overall, I guess, comment from Prochaska and Di Clemente, who hypothesised the transtheoretical model, said that probably the most obvious and direct implication of their research is the need to assess the stage of a client's readiness and tailor interventions accordingly. So all along they've said you should use someone's stage of change to tailor interventions, the right intervention for the right person at the right time. And there's loads of good research here that tells us what to do for all these different stages, what sort of interventions and exercises. So we were able to pull that out and put together coaching guides. So once somebody's gone through the assessment, we can provide their case managers with a nice one-page coaching guide that was comprised really of about 100 pages of research on what to say with that person in a one-to-one that purports to engage with them more. And rather than alienate them, because if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time of their level of commitment, it actually alienates them. So it's fascinating. So here are the results. Did stage match interventions, not including action people in the psychosocial intervention because it had no significant impact at all, did it improve things? Well, the results there are it's all 60% overall higher than study one's treatment as usual. Overall, it's an enormous improvement, an embarrassingly high almost. What's considered world-leading uplifts in placements is 13%, and we're getting 60% of our treatment as usual. And I don't think I emphasised the number of people that took part in this study was just over 20,000. We had 8,000 going through the treatment, stage match treatment workshops, and 12,000 as a control in exactly the same locations. So it's a really nice, robust study. So, answering the hypothesis, overall, 31% of participants going through treatment as usual return to work, but those going through the stage match one-to-ones and everyone bar action going through the psychosocial intervention, 44% of them return to work. Looking at the moderators, and this is really as well the crux of what we're trying to uncover, is does everyone respond to positive psychology at the same rates? Particularly people that are unemployed or feeling low, there's high levels of depression, anxiety, etc. and stress. So gender, well, with this larger group, and with a more considered delivery, then they responded just as well. Female participants responded just as well. We were able to measure the streaming tool that the government uses. This puts people into levels of support based on extrinsic factors and barriers. Do you have one leg? Can you speak English? Do you read English? Where do you live? What's your postcode? All of these external barriers. Do you drive? What's your level of education? They put people in streams to determine what level of support they should have. And we could see that actually the response for people in stream 3 and stream 4 was very positive. There was a significant impact with those. And again, emotionally, that was my key driver with this. These are the people that have been parked, rather. Yes.
Which way does it go? Which one's the more disadvantaged?
So, stream 1 are the closest people to employment. And there's a financial motivator for people to support these different levels. You get about $80 to support somebody who's a stream 1 into work. These are employment service companies, government subcontractors. whereas you get 11,000 if somebody's in stream 4, because they need more intensive support. The other moderators we looked at, where we had a much bigger sample, over 2,000 of over 55s, they responded well, but we finally had a lot of people from remote areas, about 1,300, and great, we could, oh bugger, they didn't respond at all. In fact, it seemed to have a negative impact on people in remote areas returning to work. And this is confounding, it's dumbfounding. So the first research with this is, okay, well, let's have a look at moderators. How do different demographics respond to positive psychological interventions? Is it a gender thing? Is it an indigenous thing? Are indigenous people not responding as well to this psychosocial intervention as white Aussies in the outback? Well, it turned out, no, we captured indigenous data from over nearly 3,000 of them, and they responded just as well to this. So it seems to imply that it's nothing to do with indigenousness, if that's even a word, it's actually to do with remoteness. And this suggests that we can make a massive difference to people's intrinsic motivation and activation to want to get a job. But we're not making a massive difference if the extrinsic barriers, there's no jobs there, or the mines are all closing down. We can't override that. So it's a fascinating study there. So what did we find? Placement rates went up massively. Stage matching interventions were. What's changing in them though? We don't know, we weren't able to measure with this if they were still in those jobs 3 months later. We weren't able to see what had changed in them. We're doing interventions to improve well-being, resilience and self-efficacy, but we weren't able to measure it because this is an applied study, and they said, look, you can get away with a 5-minute on their smartphone survey, but to ask them to do all of these other things, there's no way we're going to let you loose on them. And the employment service companies and the government were just interested in higher outcomes. But for me, I'd love to find out whether it was well-being, resilience, self-efficacy, or a mix of all of those that were improving. And I don't know, I don't really know. I can only conjecture the answer why it didn't work in remote Australia. So the significance of this, well, obviously I went into this 5 years worrying it was an empty voice. It was all been completely pointless. I found nothing. But luckily there were a few things, and that would have been interesting in itself. You know, it would have still been a complete thesis. But it seems that there were a few contributions to the field, and they are, there are discrete segments of job-seeking attitude. These discrete segments or stages exist. Then we found a new stage of change, unauthentic action, psychosocial interventions that aim to build these 3 constructs, resilience, well-being, self-efficacy, do improve return to work outcomes, but not for everybody. Stage-matched, person-centric interventions work even better, and Indigenous Australians respond just as well, but we might need to research a bit more in those remote areas to find out what's really going on there. For policy, this is interesting because nearly all policy targets Indigenous Australians, but there isn't a discrete remote employment program. So these are sort of things we're discussing with the Department of Jobs at the moment. And for me, I suppose the most satisfying part of this is that we don't have to give up on those that aren't up for work. That's the bottom line for me. So all of this is just justifying my emotional thing is that, okay, they don't want a job, let's not give up on them. Actually, we'll get great results by supporting their capacity and self-efficacy and well-being to return to work. That's it. Any immediate questions? No? Good.
Who do you want to take first?
Mr. Herb.
Let's see, I spent a couple of months in Rhode Island working with earlier versions of the Transtheoretical model. And one of the issues that, okay, there were 2 issues. One is stage-specific interventions. And at that time, the support for that was still a little shaky. Certainly there's a big difference between when the outcome is negative versus positive, and that the model works a little bit differently for those. But then the other one that I didn't see in their discussion is that a lot of what they were saying was that if you have a target outcome, that may not be appropriate for measuring the effect of the intervention if people are at different stages. So that a big focus of the research I was looking at, which was physical activity, so it wasn't related to that, but it was moving people from one stage to another. And so if some of your pre-contemplation people moved to contemplation, even if they didn't get the final goal, that was an important change. I don't know whether you looked at that in relation with your thesis.
We did, because it is an outcome, as far as I was concerned, moving people up the stages, tracking whether they go back down and back up again. We were able to track it with a youth cohort. There was only 70, it wasn't that 75, but about 78 of them. And they actually, during the intervention, their stage went down, but then afterwards it was back up generally above where they were initially. But the difficulty I had in persuading employment service companies to measure that is they're saying, oh, we don't want to keep doing them every 3 weeks or we just get them to do it once, which was tough enough. And for them, for the government and for the employment service companies, they were only interested in that one outcome. Whereas self-efficacy and self-determination is, to get there, that's a big leap. Small steps build self-efficacy and make you more likely. So you're right, it is a big concern. There's as many comments about stage of change being inappropriate as much literature as it is supporting its efficacy. So it's but I couldn't practically in this applied study look at that.
Okay. So, fair enough. Good. Thank you.
So I should have done you first because you shouldn't even be here. Sorry, Paul.
So first of all, I absolutely love this research. From my point of view, this is an example of the very best research that we do here. So congratulations. That said, well, one of the reasons why I love it is I just think of how many people you've changed their lives. It's extraordinary, huge numbers through good research. So I'm unequivocal in my support. I'm wondering about how the staff in the agencies responded to the intervention. Did you do any quality checking? Did you do any testing of what they thought of the programming?
Yes. So initially there was resistance, as I said, to the assessment itself. And then what I did was I studied mechanical versus clinical interventions and found that it was, again, unequivocal that mechanical intervention is more accurate than clinical face-to-face intervention. In fact, the only thing that impacts significantly on the efficacy of a clinical intervention is if you know that person and you're given more time with an individual, and then you become less accurate versus the clinical. But of course, when I told case managers that to logically argue them around to adopting this, it annoyed them even more. So then we had to go through what does this do for them? And their biggest issue is those people that aren't in a proactive stage of change, they don't know what to do with them. They're not trained in coaching, solutions focused, motivational interviewing. They're not given ways of turning around negative conversations. So we say, you can use something called scaling. And that gets them saying positive things. And again, all these post-site coaching interventions, that's what got them to adopt it, was because it kind of gave them freedom and tools to deal with those that didn't really want to get a job, that were only turned up for their intervention saying, oh, come on, I've got 5 minutes. The car's parked on a dodgy meter, I've got to get out of here. Then we did observations, and we trained their site managers to do observations, because for the main survey we had to train up 379 case managers all around Australia in 3 months, and then retrain up their managers to really know this so they can tell what's going on. But that integrity of delivery was tough to guarantee and assure. I'm sure if we could really get on top of them, really good coaches, the results might have been even better. But yeah, it was something that had been hand reading for 6 months at least. So finally, sorry.
I'll reiterate what Paul's about. It's incredibly impressive. I mean, it's hard to believe that it's a PhD thesis. So very impressive. was at your CSC, I made a comment that one of my concerns was what happens when you do this psychosocial intervention when there are no jobs. And so it's interesting that you found that with the remote stuff. I don't know if I told you at the time, there's a really paper exactly on this issue by Martin Tomasek and Raina Silbereisen from the University of Jena. And they broke down Germany into the local government units. And they looked at the relationship between engagement in job-seeking activity and well-being. And what they found is that the relationship was positive in every county except for those with the highest levels of unemployment. And the relationship actually reversed. So there's more engagement led to lower well-being. And so I'm wondering whether with your remote issues that this might be a case where your intervention actually had a negative effect on well-being rather than
That's
positive.
right. I've never come across that. That's so relevant. Now I've got to rewrite the whole thesis. No, but this is great. This is perfect. Yeah, I'm going to take a note of that because there's no way I know how to spell those names.
And I know I talked to Martin about a year ago, and I know that he's doing a bit more of this research, so it might be worth contacting him and seeing where he's up to.
Thank you. Sorry.
A really interesting aspect is the stage-specific interventions, and you don't really have a strong test of that. Your test of that is based upon another study, where there wasn't random assignment between the two studies. It was random. And you've told us how much you learned from the first study, so obviously you were doing it much better the second study. And so to really nail down the stage-specific intervention aspect, you needed a stage non-specific intervention group in the second study. I'm not saying that that's
Then you could really test it.
And I wonder how much of your improvement in the second section was because you were doing it a lot better. And as opposed to being that it was specific to the stage. Logically, it should be that way, but I know that there's a lot of research that questions that aspect of that theoretical model.
Yeah, that's definitely a limitation to be able to. Yeah, I should mention that in my conclusion because it is.
Is to randomize. So you have your 5 interventions, and then randomize one group to the 5, so they don't. It's totally mismatched. So it's not a general one. You actually put the action people into contemplation.
Well, that would be even more convoluted, but I agree. But even having the generic one for one group, independent of what group they were in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think that these practical folks seem not to like these exploratory ideas where you think something's not going to work. But his action stage did not. He dropped. They wouldn't let him do the workshop part, so it actually had less intervention than the previous study and did better. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and again with that we had lots of discussions and then looking at the literature. Why were action people who go through the workshop responding not at all negatively? Was it because they were surrounded by people that were less enthusiastic? Was it because I know all this, I want to get on with doing the job? And that in itself kind of supports the stage of change. But I've been surprised at the eagerness of Prochaska and Vesk in particular to look at this. They nagged me last week for the, which I've sent to them, that last paper, which suggests that robustness of evidence isn't there. And it isn't that robust in my finding paper, it is a limitation.
And part of that model, of course, is the follow-up. And you've got that to an extent. Yeah. But remarkable that you've got it to the extent that you have, but you really would love to be able to follow it up more than just through the 3 months.
Yes,
yeah.
and I'm sure there's a way of, what is it that's working? I mean, through 31 exercises in the workshop, there's about 7 different types for each different stage. There might only be one of them that's really working for each stage, and to be able to determine that is the 80-20 rule there. Brilliant, sorry.
So, only because I read it, and the example of that was when I was reading through couple of things came to mind about, you listed the costs of unemployment, and there's actually a few more that might strengthen the case. So, I mean, there's the family stress hypothesis that suggests that parents who are unemployed negatively affect the development of their children throughout their life. And that's a cost, not just in the here and now when unemployment is bad, but it can have ongoing effects as those kids come into the labour market later on.
And that's second pilot paper evidence that the lit review was the impact on 15 to 25-year-olds getting a job and what they're facing, and that was a massive predictor of their likelihood to be an employed generation.
Yeah. And the other thing that came to mind is that unemployment is related to well-being even for those that are employed. And so we found a correlation between well-being and unemployment rates in youth who are not even in the labour market. It was above 0.6. So, there's this real, unemployment affects everybody.
Wait, so they're not seeking work, but they're still classified as unemployed?
No, they're not seeking work, but the unemployment rate is
in their
correlated. The unemployment rate in the nation is correlated with
the nation level.
Historical data.
Okay.
Is that because of a hope?
I think it has to do with when unemployment is high, the nation as a whole tends to suffer. Everything becomes a little more competitive.
It was funny looking at the data from WA. It was just before and during the mining shutdown, but the levels of pre-contemplation and the lower levels there were higher than in other areas. It actually seemed to be a few months before the shutdown, so maybe news stories were coming out, and that pessimism versus optimism. Interesting. Thank you.
On the scale, did you actually see whether there was a difference between people who were made redundant because, say, the whole entire company was made, but you went bust, or it was just them specific in a sort of like a cut-out?
It was then at one point in time, because you'd think taking it on personally and the identity of being a teacher and you being made redundant because the whole school closed, but that's what warrants who you are. The identity of your profession has a massive impact. If you as an individual, you're sacked and you're individually made redundant, that has a high negative impact of the whole factory that made redundant. But then the hope, because then you can beat against 200, 300 other people with the same jobs, but we couldn't look at that. We could only see people at one point in time, we couldn't get the reason for them being unemployed, whether it's generational or whether it's frictional unemployment. It's a good perspective. Sorry.
Questions like, in the validation study, you say that the relative position of three factors really match to the 5 stages change, right? So how do you do the clustering?
So how do we do clustering?
Yeah.
So the relative sectors of, what was that?
How is the measure scored?
Yeah, it's a scoring of the
Oh yes, and there's something like 553 million possible ways of answering because there's a 5-point Likert scale. So, and within the 12 questions, there are 4 questions for each of 3 sort of approaches or mentalities: action, contemplation, pre-contemplation. And of course, the pre-contemplation scores a reverse score, and then you just look at their relation to each other. And that gives you which stage they're in. But that was what's so difficult about the unauthentic action, because they were scoring really highly on action, sort of low on contemplation, really high in pre-contemplation. So it gave you a chart like that, if you like. But there was nothing in the literature that allowed for that, and yet 21% of participants were in that.
But that would be kind of unique to that situation because there's a financial incentive. They have to at least be pretending to be looking for a job.
Yes, exactly, because they're sanctioned if they're not. And when I spoke to Rhode Island, they said, we have come across this, but it's only about 0.5 to 1% of people giving up smoking or bullying or all of the other.
I would imagine in this day and age, giving up smoking would have some of that as well.
It may do.
Because it's got such a social stigma that's become attached to it.
But they call it unreflective action. But when I spoke to a couple of job seekers and they weren't not reflective. They knew exactly what they were doing and why, because of what you said, that coercion, the sanctions, and the social pressure. Yes, so it was. So we call it inauthenticness, and we call it unauthentic. And then we had to make sure the participants couldn't see their scores, because they'd be going, what does that mean? I'm unauthentic or pre-contemplating. So they never saw what they're categorised. They got a nice sort of message that was relevant to them.
This is a really good point, I mean, about the cuts, because the way they do it, they use cut-off scores, right? The question is always, can a continuous version of the scale predict better? But
It's not, yeah, okay.
But the intervention, the problem is the intervention. So this is why you got to prove that it has treated utility, because it's meant to guide intervention. So if you're in pre-contemplation, it means you're doing value clarification or something like that. If you're in action, you're doing resume writing. So there is practical utility for the cut points, but from a statistical perspective, the continuous one would probably be better than anything that would try to divide it up.
It's different than that. It's not quite that clear cut.
Are there times when the cut points do better than?
Well, it really is stages, and the stages are presented as a continuum, but they aren't really a continuum. So they are discrete states. Yeah. You were talking about the how negative it is to be laid off and then be made redundant. I would imagine that would have been much more negative a generation ago when it wasn't commonplace, whereas now it's almost the norm.
That was one of the interventions we had to implement, because the stigma attached was so much higher when it was a job for life, compared to now when we change jobs 5-6 times, careers a few times. So it's not scary.
I look at things from a frame of reference perspective. We think that frame of reference will change because societal changes.
Sorry.
No worries. What's next? Like, how is this being picked up?
Well, there's now been 107,000 people go through this, because those firms that used it continue to use it. What's interesting now are 3 sectors. One, return to work for work cover. So eye care piloted this and got great results with people returning to work due to injury, largely anxiety, stress and depression. We have to train up case managers to it. But then some people that were using this also delivered full services to apprentices. So I said, oh, can we use that to predict if an apprentice is really committed to their job or not? It's basic stage, their apprenticeship or not. So we've had Darren did a lit review, changed the questions, back and forth, and it seems to be, but I haven't had time to really focus on that. And then student retention. Can we forecast that a student is likely to drop out before they do drop out? It's really application of stage of change rather than a psychosocial intervention. What we're really finding the driver for it is people like student support or apprenticeship support don't have the tools to work with somebody that's likely to drop out. And they feel unsupported, but also by the time they're given someone to deal with, it's because they haven't turned up for 6 weeks. It's like the horse has bolted, so we can predict. So that's little things that people have inquired about. But for me personally, I want to work out what's changed in the individual. Is it well-being? Is it resilience? Is it self-efficacy? You can measure those things and see, okay, did they go up in well-being or not at all? It was the self-efficacy building that really improved return to work. That's what fascinates me the most.
They've got pretty brief instruments for those constructs that they're using with that model. You can probably get away with an extra 15 items. And surely you build up enough credibility with some of the organizations.
Yes.
When you have it automated and so forth, you're only really talking about an extra minute or two to complete another 15 or 20 items. I would think that with a little bit of using the good connections that you already had, that you could build that into the intervention.
Yeah, and I got someone to agree to it, and I got ethics approval to do it, and then that
Way
company
beyond my suggestion.
disappeared. So yeah, it's exactly that. And they were giving us 200 people to dabble, but yeah, that company got bought out. So it's all up in the air. But iCare are interested. We're meeting with them next week to pursue that. It's fascinating.
Surely you could shorten the intervention, make it cheaper for them, or something like that.
Yeah, the financial implications or commercial ones are just logical.
Okay, I think it's about time. Right, thank you very much. Right, thanks everyone.